Hello, everyone. I'm Lucya, and I'm going to talk about psychogeography. I've been introduced already, so yes, I'm a witch, I'm a pagan, I'm a writer. I studied psychogeography as part of my MA in Literary London, and I was doing it as a practitioner before that. I'm going to start by talking about something I experienced as a child. I said that I had been doing psychogeography for a long while, and this experience as a child kind of sums up to me what psychogeography is about. You can consider it writing, fact, fiction, or something in between, and it's called Follow the Grey Tarmac Path. There was a shimmering in the air in the alleyway between the back gardens behind the houses. It seemed for one long moment like a rent in the fabric of reality, a portal beckoning the way to a world that was larger, more exciting, where the colours were brighter, perhaps over the rainbow. But I knew it was just a heat haze caused by the sun on the tarmac. And it was getting late in the afternoon, the time for adventures. Even adventures of the imagination were slipping away. I was 11. It was the end of August, nearly the end of the long summer holiday before the new school. And I was old enough to realise that adventures like that don't really happen, and that heat hazes are similar to those desert mirages that promise wonders to parched travellers, but only lead to dry sand. It was a long while ago, but the image is more vivid in my memory than anything else from that sunny summer at the end of childhood. And I do wonder if I should have walked down that alleyway, followed the grey tarmac path through the shimmering air to find the world that was larger, brighter, more exciting than one where science rules. A world where the imagination could create wonders for everyone and not just the very young. Right, so what's that got to do with psychogeography? I hope that's what my talk will explain. I'll be going into definitions of psychogeography, some about its history, how to do it, current movements in psychogeography, some of my own thoughts about it, and a few of my creative examples, which I hope you enjoy. Definitions of psychogeography. Well, very simply, it usually involves moving around in a town, city, or other urban environment, typically on foot, but not always, and picking up the atmosphere or energy of the place. Then generally doing something with that, often writing or some other creative art form. The most quoted definition comes from Guy Debord in Paris in the 1950s, who described it as the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. Now, I know that does make it sound like something out of a sociology textbook, and some psychogeographers have thought of it in those terms, but these days it's a bit different to that, more art and less science. The back cover blurb on a book called Psychogeography by Merlin Coverley says, "Psychogeography provides us with new ways of apprehending our surroundings, transforming the familiar streets of our everyday experience into something new and unexpected." His book is a very good introduction for anyone wanting to learn more about psychogeography, and I am indebted to it for quite a bit of the information in this talk. Another definition comes from Joseph Hart, who did a write-up about a psychogeographer's convention in New York in 2004, in an article entitled "A New Way of Walking." He wrote, "Psychogeography, a slightly stuffy term that's been applied to a whole toy box full of playful, inventive strategies for exploring cities. Psychogeography includes just about anything that takes pedestrians off their predictable path and jolts them into a new awareness of the urban landscape." Now, the term itself was coined by the French movement Lettres International, a group of radical artists and theorists in the early 1950s. The idea was that by wandering around a city, you could not only apprehend the environment in the best way, you could also envisage a new urban environment to overcome the banality of the modern world, as they put it. It was seen as a method of urban change. This was taken up by Guy Debord and the left-wing political group Situationist International, which was active in France again in the 1950s and in the 1960s. It was in 1955 that he came up with that definition. In its early days, the Situationists saw psychogeography as a tool for assessing the emotional impact of cities on their inhabitants. They thought it was a revolutionary activity, but they kind of gave it up and moved on to more standard revolutionary activities like rioting. Although the term was first coined in Paris in the 1950s, Coverley and others trace its real origins to London a few centuries earlier. Daniel Defoe's novel, A Journal of the Plague Year, has the narrator exploring the streets of London during the Great Plague of 1665. And actually, reading that book at the time of the pandemic, it was kind of an interesting kind of comparison, really. The narrator it's not a factual account. It is written. It's a fictional character as the main character, and he decides that he's not going to stay indoors and be sensible and stay in quarantine like everybody else does. He's going to wander out and about and see what's going on and write about the things people got up to, like deciding that they're going to stay in the pub and then catch the plague and things like that. Anyway, although it is fictional, the protagonist and what happens is very realistic. Another important historic figure is the poet and painter William Blake, who's been described as the godfather of psychogeography because of his imaginary reconstruction of London as the New Jerusalem. Other visionary precursors include the writer Thomas de Quincey, who described his drug-fueled journeys around London in his book Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and Arthur Machen, who wrote The London Adventurer, The Art of Wandering, The Great God Pan and the Hill of Dreams. And they all include quite a lot of walking around London particularly, and kind of picking up on the atmosphere of the place. Arthur Watkins, who came up with the idea of ley lines, is also seen as highly influential, and I'll talk more about him later. Right. Another figure in psychogeography's historical path is the flâneur. Now, the word is French for stroller and was typically a posh 19th century French bloke who sauntered about the city. He saw himself as a detached observer of contemporary life. Now, I'm saying flâneurs were blokes because in the early days they primarily were. And there were also men who were independently wealthy. Back in the 19th century and earlier, women tended to have roles that restricted their ability to just stroll around the streets. Obviously, that's not been the case for a long while, but for some reason, there's still debate in academic circles about whether women can be flâneurs or even whether women can be psychogeographers. And I actually wrote my MA dissertation on how women's writing teaches us to see London, with an emphasis on women's urban exploration. Now, I'm going to go a little bit into the argument about the quite ridiculous arguments that women can't do psychogeography or be flâneurs. A key argument about whether flânery was an exclusively male activity or whether the female flâneur, the flâneuse, existed. And that centres on how visible women were when outdoors. The original idea was that the flâneur observed the city without themselves being noticeable in the crowd, but women, according to men at least, stood out too much. Whether this is true now, if it ever was, is still debated for some reason. Sociologist Gene Wolfe is one of the main academics quoted. In The Invisible Flâneuse, Woman and the Literature of Modernity in 1985, she wrote that the flâneuse could not exist in the past, as such a character was rendered impossible by the sexual divisions of the 19th century. Art historian Griselda Pollock, in Vision and Difference, Feminism, Femininity and History of Art in 1988, agreed with her. About the flâneur in 19th century Paris, she wrote, "Women did not enjoy the freedom of incognito in the crowd. They are the object of the flâneur's gaze." So yeah, men could go around not being noticed at all, eyeing up women, but women couldn't do that to men or to anyone, supposedly. Deborah Parsons, in Street Walking the Metropolis, Women, the City and Modernity in 2000, offers an opposing view and gives examples of ways the city can be viewed as female space by urban writers in London and in Paris from 1880 to 1940. In the chapter Wandering the London Wasteland, Parsons argues that the flâneuse offers a different but complementary perspective to the flâneur. She cites several female authors, including Jean Rhys, who wrote about Bohemian society, as well as being the author of Wild Sargasso Sea, and Doris Lessing, author of the Martha Quest books, among others. Parsons point out their writing of the city in texts results from their walking of the city as text. The idea of the city as text basically means you can read the signs that you see and the stories within it. Woolf, who thought the flâneuse couldn't exist, has slightly changed her opinions this millennium. In Keynote, Unmapped Spaces, Gender, Generation and the City for Feminist Review in 2010, Woolf states that although she earlier wrote the flâneur could only be male because women couldn't be invisible, she mentioned that in fact older women in cities are actually often thought of as invisible. She wrote, "In our culture, older women are, in a sense, invisible. If their presence is unremarked, both in everyday life and in cultural theory, then perhaps they pass in unmapped spaces. They also have the freedom to ignore the normal constraints of appropriate behaviour. So middle-aged women have an advantage then. And we don't have to behave appropriately." Well, being a middle-aged woman, I think I'll take that as a result. Sometimes the word flâneuse is used as a generic term for women who explore the city on foot, such as Lauren Elkin's Flâneuse in 2016. She argues that the flâneuse and female psychogeographer exist in women from all walks of life who get to know the city by wandering its streets, investigating dark corners, peering behind facades, and penetrating into secret courtyards. Now, I've put some of the books there that I read. There were a few of the books that I read when I was doing my MA dissertation. I would genuinely recommend Street Haunting by Virginia Woolf, as well as Mrs. Dalloway, but Street Haunting is a very short story and you can find it on Project Gutenberg. It is very short, and that's a very good one. Doris Lessing's female, probably middle-aged observer in London Observed travels or sits in cafes watching people and coming up with stories. Iris Murdoch also writes about urban exploration. Although in Under the Net, which is the book there, the main character is depicted as male. There are a huge number of other women, particularly writers is what I've studied. But yeah, there are a huge number of other women and they just kind of get not considered to be so important, even though their work is really just as good. And it's a bit of a silly thing, really. Anyway, now moving on from feminism to the weirdness of the 1970s. From the 1970s to the end of the millennium was when psychogeography got a new boost and took a new turn into weirdness. In London, that was largely due to the writer Iain Sinclair. Iain Sinclair's 1975 book, Lud Heat, is set in London, the city of King Lud, during a hot summer. And it was influenced by ideas of ley lines, Egyptian funerary rites, and magical symbolism in Hawksmoor's churches. Iain Sinclair, as well as being it's kind of a lot of its poetry, he was working as a gardener in cemeteries around London and came up with some extremely weird ideas. I mean, it's fictional, it's not real, but this idea that there's this kind of occult symbolism and occult lines of energy running between different churches in London, and it's very, very weird. He employs visionary and occult aspects of psychogeography in a way that was innovative. Then at the turn of the millennium, he wrote one of his most famous books, London Orbital, a description of walks around the M25 motorway. It's less about occult correspondences and more about social comment, and it is a much easier read than Ludheat. He's written quite a few other books about walking around London and exploring London since then. Along with Iain Sinclair, Will Self, John Rogers, Nick Papadimitriou have all produced famous creative works of psychogeography. Although Iain and Nick later said they preferred the term deep topography to describe their walks of urban discovery. The documentary, The London Perambulator, is the work of all four of them, along with the nowadays somewhat controversial figure Russell Brand. And that documentary follows Nick as he walks through some of London's overlooked and derelict areas and talks about his strange theories about deities of derelict sites. And yeah, it is on YouTube. John Rogers' book, This Other London, Adventures in the Overlooked City, describes routes that he has taken and you could follow them. So if you kind of want to follow in the footsteps of someone and do an actual walk, you can follow that. Psychogeography has grown, but also really mutated, with many individuals and groups using the technique of urban drifts being aimless wanders, to create art, write books, both fiction and non-fiction, to blog, make films, record sounds, give talks, conduct perambulatory theatre, and naturally conduct guided psychogeography walks, which some might say runs against the theory of psychogeography, with the idea of it being kind of aimless wandering. But I think the whole thing about psychogeography, it's like as soon as someone sets up a rule about what it is, someone says, no, it isn't, it does something completely different. So the idea of it being this kind of toy box that you can pick things out of is quite apt. Right, now that is a picture I took on one of Minimum Labyrinth's walks. For a taste of psychogeography style walks with an expert guide, I would recommend checking out Minimum Labyrinth's website. The guys behind it are Robert Kingham and Rich Cochrane, who conduct walks into the London of Arthur Machen, the Pantheon of London, the Ghosts of Drury Lane, and a wonderful 10-hour pub crawl along the Thames with readings from Peter Ackroyd's London, the Biography. I've done that twice. I was very drunk at the end of it both times. 10 pubs, 10 hours. Yeah, it's, you start off being incredibly like, oh yes, this, that, and the other. And by the end, it's like, oh yeah, I'm pretty, yeah, Israel, you're my friend. Anyway, so much for the, yeah, let's move on from that. Robert Kingham has given a talk called A Line, which links psychogeography to ley lines, something that's also a focus of Sinclair's Ludheat and Ackroyd's Hawksmoor. One of the theories that keeps cropping up is that you can use psychogeography to sense or tap into mystical alignments such as ley lines. I'm sure I don't really need to explain what ley lines are to anyone here, but very briefly, they're the concept that there are straight lines running through prominent points in the landscape. And a theory is they follow prehistoric tracks or go through sites of spiritual or cultural significance, like wells, megaliths, mounds, and temples. Some also believe earth energy is channeled along ley lines, empowering or powered by landmarks along the way, often man-made structures. And many ley lines run through London. Psychogeography offers the theory that the landscape and geography of a place affects the psychology of those who live or work there. So similar types of activity tend to reoccur in the same place throughout history, which neatly ties in with ley line theory. Peter Ackroyd's time-hopping murder mystery Hawksmoor uses that idea that things that happen in a place tend to reoccur there again and again. His novel takes concepts from Lud Heat and runs further with them. Ackroyd's novel is pure fiction, but some people take ideas from psychogeographical fiction and wander down the conspiracy theory road. One conspiracy theory that crops up is the concept of the evil town planner, using city architecture to control the psychology of residents and workers, or even to create warped lines of malignant energy for nefarious and probably occult purposes. One theory tracks a line of malignant energy crossing through the pyramid structure on top of Canada Tower, the big office block in Canary Walk, running through Hawksmoor's Church, St. Anne Limehouse, which is the site of another pyramid, and onto the Greenwich Observatory. It was, according to the theory, fed by a nuclear reactor once housed at the Greenwich Naval College. Greenwich University is in the Greenwich Naval College, and that's where I went to do my MA. So it's kind of, it felt quite appropriate that I was doing an MA that touched on psychogeography and studying Lud Heat and Hawksmoor and that kind of thing, at a site which is considered to be quite important to that, with a Hawksmoor church just over the road, because one of Hawksmoor's churches is in Greenwich. Yeah, so moving on from that, a 1987 Film 4 movie about conspiracy theories called Hidden City is also seen as being influenced by the psychogeography of London. You can find that on YouTube as well. Again, it's not a documentary, but sometimes ideas in psychogeographical works kind of blur the lines. While some authors, especially at the turn of the millennium, seemed to want to concentrate on what was grim and depressing about our city, psychogeography can also be inspiring and fun, and perhaps offer magical ways to re-envisage our own local areas. So let me take you to a place in southeast London where the elements meet, a crossroads where change, movement and transformation could perhaps be envisaged. I'm going to read another of my bits of psychogeographical writing. I have a sip of water first. That rather dull-looking scene of a suburban railway station near where I live is a crossroads of the elements. Water in the form of a culverted stream runs underneath the railway. Sometimes it bursts through onto the pavement. The road and track represent earth. The bridge is air, and fire powers the trains that run along it. Well, electricity these days, but I recall a few steam trains going through the station in my youth. Crossroads are enchanted places where different worlds converge, as well as different roads. They are places where, in folklore, one might meet fairies, vampires, wandering spirits, the goddess Hecate, or even the odd witch. They're places where choices are made and the future is therefore not certain. They are traditional places to do magic, or even make a pact with the devil. Mind you, that might not be such a good idea on a railway bridge in the rush hour. Now, more on walking. Earlier, I said that an important component of psychogeography is a journey. Usually walking, although wheelchairs and other forms of moving around are completely valid. And in fact, one psychogeographical walk that I went on was led by someone who'd broken their leg very badly and was in a wheelchair for the entire journey. So yeah, it does seem quite ableist to be talking about walking, but Doris Lessing describes an underground journey in a way that is quite psychogeographical when she's sitting on an underground train. So yeah, you don't have to be walking. However, I am a person who thinks best when I am walking. When I was at university, I used to go for long walks while mulling over ideas for essays. I found the rhythmic process helped me think. I still find going for a walk, especially on a sunny day, inspires ideas for writing better than sitting in front of a blank screen. Some of the world's greatest philosophers thought best on their feet too. Nietzsche, Thoreau, Rimbaud, Rousseau, Nerval and Kant were all keen ramblers. According to Frederick Gross in a book called A Philosophy of Walking, it can be a spiritual activity from walking meditations to pilgrimages to some kinds of shamanic journeys. In the countryside, walking can help us get in touch with nature. In London, it can help us feel the pulse of the city beneath our feet, to perhaps get in touch with the spirits that rest within the man-made as much as within the natural, to maybe sense the ancient gods and goddesses of lost rivers that flow beneath the pavement, which kind of, I think, ties quite nicely into the Rivers of London books. Now, Gross writes that the flâneur bypasses the awfulness of the city to re-mythologize it, invent new divinities, explore the poetic surface of the urban spectacle. Now, that word re-mythologize, I think, is significant. And mythogeography is a term that I came across in a book called On Walking by Phil Smith. Phil Smith is now an associate professor at the University of Plymouth. He's an academic researcher, writer, and artist specializing in walking, site-specific performance, dramaturgy, and mythogeographies. I've known him for quite a few years. In his early book on walking, Phil describes a psychogeographical walk he made in Suffolk, following a route taken by another author, W.G. Debord, for his 1995 The Rings of Saturn. And it was back then that Smith coined the term mythogeography. Here's an extract in which Phil explains what he means by that. Mythogeography is an experimental approach to places as if they were sites for performance, crime scenes, or amateur excavations, let's say grave robbing, of multiple layers of treasure, to get at these different aspects of place and space. Mythogeography draws on all kinds of low theory, amateur and poetic assemblings into manifestos of things I've learnt while out on the road. Mythogeography is a hybrid of ideas, tactics, and strategies. It embraces both respectable, academic, scientific, culturally validated, and non-respectable, Fortean, antiquarian, mystical, fictional knowledges. It judges these first against their own criteria and then sets the different knowledge in orbit about each other, seeking to intuit their gravitational pulls upon each other. Mythogeography explores atmospheres and the effects of psychogeography. It joins in the Fortean procession of damned data, those anomalies that are not denied but marginalized by respectable science. It is a general approach which emphasizes hybridity and multiplicity. And here's what Phil offers as a technique, and he calls it Crabman's razor. A common research protocol is Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest explanation is the likeliest. Turn this around and adopt, no matter how fragmentary and partial your evidence, the most complex, sinister, and portentous explanations possible until disproved by the evidence. Now on to some practical advice on how to set out on a walk. Right, borrowing again from On Walking, which is a book that's very well worth reading, I'd say. Phil offers 5 steps to the beginnings of a great walk. First, know why. Set off intending to see the world afresh. Do things to disrupt your normal way of looking at what's around you. Know where. Phil writes, start in the familiar and head straight away off into the unknown. Remember, you do not have to get anywhere. There is no set destination. It's all about the journey. Follow instincts. Knowing me and knowing you. Pick who you're going to go with. You can go alone, but another person or a small group can be good to bounce ideas off. Ideally, not too many. A drift can dissolve into chit-chat if you're not too careful. Know how. Phil writes, you need to free yourself both from your everyday and your usual walking habits. Maybe start at a time that's odd for you. Find a way to get off your beaten tracks. Know what. We're back to sensible shoes and suitable clothing. I really cannot emphasize, if you are going on a really long walk, you want to be comfortable. Also, taking a notebook and pen, a camera or your phone these days, water, snacks, and also take anything weird with you that you think you might want to use along the way. He suggests things like a tape measure for measuring things, or offerings to leave is another thing that people suggest. Something environmental I would recommend, something the birds might want, but yeah. Now, while those are all good tips on how to do psychogeography, to get started, sometimes you just need a simple, clear instruction. Here's one from a feature entitled A Road of One's Own by travel writer Robert Macfarlane, and it was published in the Times Literary Supplement. Psychogeography, a beginner's guide. Unfold a street map of London, place a glass, rim down, anywhere on the map and draw around its edge. Pick up the map, go out into the city, walk the circle, keeping as close as you can to the curve. Record the experience as you go, in whatever medium you favour. Film, photograph, manuscript, tape. Catch the textual runoff of the streets, the graffiti, the branded litter, the snatches of conversation. Cut the sign, log the data stream, be alert to the happenstance of metaphors, watch for visual rhythms, coincidences, analogies, family resemblances, the changing mood of the street. And the record ends. Walking makes for content, footage for footage. Now, as you can see, I had a go at doing that in my own town of Penge in southeast London, the same place where that little railway was. And well, I'm a pagan, so I called my my result "Pagans Do It in Circles," and it's a little bit about the elements again, as well as a little bit about time travel. Pagans do it in circles. It's afternoon, a hot day after weeks of heat, parched ground, the bricks of the garden walls radiate. I head to the eastern quarter of my circle, the element of air, and the place of new beginnings in the pagan circle. Across the busy road, a church, but not a church, converted to flats with Gothic arches. Curtains billow in a breeze. Elsewhere wafts the smell of rubbish rotting in bags, piled on the pavement. Cars, buses, vans rumble on the main road. A church, even if it is not a church, should be a sanctuary, shouldn't it? The arc southeast takes me into the wreck. I don't keep to the path. Walking between two trees, I'm entering the moon card in tarot, between two watchtowers. I hope no one spots me. Keep off the grass, don't stray from the path. Through the alley south, no ball games on the council estate. When I was a child, a sign read, residents only. Someone had put a P in front of the R. It would have been Kennedy and Nixon back then. The image of presidents illicitly playing football. Then to the west. This road was once a market, dilapidated shops stuck in time without halting entropy. Outside another church, a faded sign proclaims it is Easter, although it is Lammas in the pagan wheel of the year. curving further back around the wheel of the year, back in time. Isn't it unlucky to leave Yule decorations up after Twelfth Night? The tower. This estate used to have more than one, built in the 1960s, then all but this demolished later. Mums with strollers look at me and wonder what I'm doing staring at their homes. I move on. Blackberries flow over a wire-topped wall, sweet and free by a pub-turned-community centre with peeling paint and spider webs. Arcing northwest, my circle crosses the railway track. The barrier is open, but a sign says ticket holders only. I cross the bridge quickly. The wrong side of the track, or the right side. The streets are less familiar, more winding, older, uphill and weary, houses built in Victorian times, when the railway brought people to populate London's borders. Curving to the northernmost arc of my circle, the element of earth. Buddleia in a brick wall, the bee bush, the bombsite plant. Under a bridge, cool shade against bright sun. A recycling truck shows everything comes full circle. I stand under another bridge. Cars beside me, train above me, rumbling, droning. A knot in the wire in case I forget. A knot for remembrance, a knot to bind a spell. This is what it was like, this moment, the here and now. I turn east, downhill, retrace my first steps along the road home. A butterfly takes to the air as I pass through my gate, into my garden. This is my sanctuary, and everything comes full circle. Okay, now Phil Smith now calls those sorts of prompts for walks scores. He organised a conference called Walking Bodies in 2019, and the papers from it were compiled into a book which contains quite a few suggestions. One score that several people tried out before the launch event for the book was this. Spend a week working out new ways to walk to the shop, school, work, etc., only by walking routes that run parallel to the route you would usually take. During the week, think about who you may be in a parallel universe or parallel life. This life does not deviate completely from, but runs along parallel lines to your actual life. What is your parallel name? Where is your parallel home? What are your parallel hobbies, parallel job, parallel partner? A slight change of topic, psychic questing. When I've discussed psychogeography in the past with those who are into the esoteric and occult, they've often made comments that psychogeography is like psychic questing, psychic archaeology, earth mysteries, or walking mindfulness meditations. And I do think there are similarities. The techniques used in all of those things can be in the psychogeographer's toolbox or toy box. But there are some differences. The picture is Glastonbury Abbey, which of course is a site famous for psychic archaeology. In psychic questing or psychic archaeology, people are trying to use psychic powers to ascertain what is there or to find something we hope might later be confirmed using more mundane or scientific tests. The psychogeographer won't necessarily be trying to do that. They will quite possibly read up on earth mysteries relating to the landscape they're exploring, read history books, newspapers, brochures about property developments, leaflets handed out by local activists and campaigners, and a whole variety of material. But they won't necessarily take any of it at face value. They're all things to consider in relation to the walked experience. The techniques of walking with mindfulness, keeping the mind focused on the moment and keeping an awareness of the environment through close observation, for example, are used in psychogeography, but with a bit of a difference. In mindfulness, being in the moment is often the desired state, but for the psychogeographer, it's only part of the process. The starting point for drifting into a daydream-like awareness in which the visionary possibilities within the landscape reveal themselves. What the psychogeographer is trying to do is create a state of liminality, to suspend disbelief, to entertain what ifs and maybes. It's a technique that many visionary artists used, whether they knew it or not, even before the term psychogeography was coined. But it's also a form of immersive art in itself, a visionary art that verges on the magical. That state of liminality is an ideal environment in which to work magic, as well as to create visionary art or literature. Psychogeography can be thought of as a way of working magic within the city, weaving possibilities with our footsteps, following that grey tarmac path to glimpse whatever it is we truly seek, or perhaps to create it using our skills of visualization. Now, I'm going to end this talk by reading another psychogeographical quest I went on in Sussex, in the town of Lewes, in search of the Holy Grail. It was once said that those seeking the Grail must be pure of heart, but these days pretty much anyone can get in on the act, so I thought a bad witch had as good a chance of any of at least finding a grail-shaped cup. The Grail has been sought by many over the centuries, and although some claim to have glimpsed it, its true location is still a mystery. According to the Book of English Magic by Philip Cargom and Richard Haygate, one place it might be is Lewes. The town in Sussex, being closer to London than the more famous Grail quest sites of France, Scotland, Wales, and Glastonbury, is the place I decided to go. Albion Street was once the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the first Templar church in Britain. Head Templar Hugh de Payenne might have hidden the Grail there, according to legend. The church no longer exists, but a curious building called the Old Library stands close to the site. I photographed the building. It was a dry, sunny day as I took my picture, but when I viewed it afterwards, I saw the image was laden with orbs. Now, the scientifically minded say orbs on photographs taken by digital cameras are simply unexpected circular patterns caused by light reflecting off subvisible particles like raindrops, pollen, or dust. It wasn't raining when I took the photo. The pollen count was low, and the air seemed clean. Those with an interest in the paranormal associate orbs with other rarely visible phenomena, ghosts, spirits, angels, or even psychoenergetic artifacts. Being on a Grail quest, there was only one way I could interpret this. It was a sign. The spirits of long-dead Templars, the guardians of the Grail, were trying to communicate with me. "Find the Grail," they were saying. "We were set to guard it, but it is gone. Find it. Make sure it is safe." Well, okay, I didn't actually hear them say that. I didn't actually see them. I only saw orbs, which might have been dust specks. And I didn't see the orbs until I was in the pub at lunchtime looking at my photos over a beer. But I was certain that's what they would have said if they could. I was left to do a spotted deduction. What might have happened to the Grail? Perhaps it had sat in someone's loft for centuries, only recently discovered, covered in dust, by some property developer with no idea of what it was. Perhaps they donated it to a worthy cause in a box with other old cups and kitchenelia. If so, a good place to start was charity shops. I do love a good charity shop. However, a quick perusal revealed no likely contenders, unless the Grail looked like an old Hofmeister tankard or 1970 celery jar. Perhaps I'd have more luck in the antique shops. Lewes is full of them. But after much peering at silver dinner sets and porcelain flower vases, I decided the Grail wasn't there either, and the search was driving me a little potty. After a detour to the tea gardens, one might even say, one Grail short of a picnic. Then I saw another sign. It was a big sign, probably put up by the council, and it pointed to Anne of Cleves' house, An inner voice seemed to tell me I should go to find the timber-framed home that King Henry VIII's more successful wife gained in her divorce settlement. The house is now a museum of items from bygone Sussex, from cannon to boot scrapers, and as many vessels and containers that could possibly be considered grails. Some people associate the Holy Grail with the life-restoring cauldrons of ancient Celtic mythology. The huge pot in Anne of Cleves' kitchen was certainly a cauldron, but it didn't feel quite like a grail, and one must trust one's senses when on a grail quest. I looked upstairs, downstairs, and in Anne of Cleves' chamber. Two large cups grabbed my attention. Both were different, yet, oddly, neither had labels saying what they were. Was one of them perhaps the Grail? It seemed to me right that one should be offered a choice when searching for the Holy Grail, and I would have to make my decision wisely. One cup was a huge and gaudy silver affair in a large glass cabinet, beautifully decorated, in perfect condition, polished until it sparkled. The other cup was an old and battered pewter chalice, standing unprotected on a granite table. It was the latter that I felt drawn to. Then I noticed that although the cup was unlabeled, the table had a long legend. It read, Reginald Fitzhers, Hugh de Moraville, William de Tracy and Richard Lebrec slew Thomas of Becket on 29 December 1170 in Canterbury. On December 31, they rode to South Mailing near Lewes. On entering the house, they threw off their arms and trappings onto the table. Suddenly, the table started back and threw its burden to the ground. The attendants replaced them, but soon a still louder crash was heard, and the table threw the articles still further onto the floor. One of the conscience-stricken knights suggesting it was refusing to bear the sacrilegious burden of their arms. Such a table would, in my opinion, be a worthy bearer and protector of the Holy Grail. Right, well, that's the end of my talk, and I do hope you enjoyed it. That's my blog, www.badwitch.co.uk. I have written quite a few books, but I've mentioned a little book of poems that I wrote, poems by a penguin being a person from Penge, a scrapbook of memories. And that was a little book of poems that I wrote as part of my MA for my creative project, which was also kind of psychogeographical. And I've indie published it as a Kindle book. So if you did enjoy my psychogeographical ramblings and want to read some more, you can find them there. But, you know, don't torture yourself. I know that other people's poetry isn't necessarily what everyone wants to read. But yeah, I've written, I'm going to end my share now.